let's talk about equity and how we can ensure equitable access to such programs. Dawn, do you want to talk us through the challenges for patients? We've touched on it a little bit, but accessing treatments in developing countries. So, what does that landscape look like?
Yeah, so it's kind of that's the Pandora's box, isn't it? So in each developing country does have its own challenges, but kind of the themes that we've seen is for a patient finding a physician who is able to treat their indication and willing to take on the added responsibility for going through the process to try to get expanded access, to try to get that compassionate access for them. Because as we've heard, it can be onerous, and depending on a particular country's local regulations and or governance, some of those hurdles can be quite impossible to one, understand, to two, navigate, and sometimes three, to actually embark on. The other challenges that I've seen come into play can be the type of drug that needs to be considered for a particular request. Some of these developing countries, when it comes to customs and importation, they have certain gating factors where they're not so comfortable bringing particular types of drugs in unknowingly, and or they have them sit in customs for an extremely long time. Patient is waiting, physician is waiting, drug is, for lack of a better term, expiring. I mean, it's sitting there. It's you don't know if it's temperature controlled, if it's being maintained in temperature, and so receiving the drug can be a challenge. And some of those pieces are so out of the company's hands, the physician's hands, and definitely out of the patient's hands.
And actually, those kind of logistics we don't tend to think of. We think of, regulatory barriers, lack of established healthcare infrastructure, or, unevolved healthcare infrastructure. We don't think about customs and postage and shipping as that being actually could be quite a fundamental barrier to access.
It is, because ultimately you want to be able to send a drug and have it received. You want that drug protected so that the patient is not at risk at the end of having dysfunctional product because something happened along the way. And then on the other side, again, and depending on the stage of development for a country and or a region where a physician might be, again, talking about the type of drug, are they able to store the quantities needed to treat a patient? Are they able to store the drug in the way that it needs to be stored? And where is the patient in relation to where the physician is? Is this patient coming in for infusions every other week, but having to drive 5 hours to get there? So then the patient adherence, which we know the patients will do everything they need to do to make it happen. But talking about quality of life, then you've just seen the patient's quality of life flip out of balance. And to some sense and degree, that becomes a concern, of course, for them, because you don't want them to have more challenges while they're trying to get better.
Yeah.
So those are a few.
And John, can an EAP be used to improve access to medicines in these areas?
Well, yeah, I mean, the answer is definitely yes. But, thinking back to the slide I presented, just showing what happens in Europe, you just think about you're in a Baltic or, an Eastern European country, the likelihood of you having access is so much lower than if you're in, more in Western Europe. So then think about if you're a patient in a low and middle income country and you're a parent of a patient of a child who's got a rare disease, and what's the likely, it's difficult to think about those types of situations because the likelihood of access even decreases more. But there are definitely pathways to make it happen. The regulatory pathways may not be quite as well defined. So oftentimes there's discussions that have to happen with the ministries of health to negotiate almost about what that can look like for a patient or a group of patients. Don touched on it. I mean, they're the complexities of the supply chain, and also understanding, does the facility that is going to be treating the patient have the capability to diagnose? Do they have the capability, if it's a minus 20 degrees C product, do they have that type of storage capabilities? So it's important that companies are thinking about what are the requirements that you have to have in place to be able to make a medicine available. Does the facility have the capability to continue monitoring, the patient from a safety perspective, from an effectiveness perspective? So there's lots of considerations. And I think, I mean, it's been kind of something that we've been, as a business, it's been interesting for us. Tanner has been doing a fair bit of work in partnership with an NGO called the Max Foundation to make medicines for the treatment of CML available in low and middle income countries. And we're embarking on a new initiative right now in partner with Global Access for Rare Disease. It was launched by the Partnerships for Quality Medical Donations in 2020, and looking to find sustainable ways to make medicines for the treatment of rare diseases available in low and middle income countries. And again, it's a number of stakeholders will have to come together, whether it's pharmaceutical companies, ministries of health, patient groups, NGOs. There's lots of stakeholders, but how can we help help more patients in these areas? And I will say why I'm encouraged by this. I think back when I was 16 years ago when I started in this space and the whole access. And I remember talking to people in the US and they'd say early access or named patient, that sounds illegal. And I think about where things have come in the last 16 years, and it gives me great hope to think about where it's not going to happen overnight, but where we could be in 20 years as the kind of the coalition of the willing come together and say, how can we make a difference? And so that's why I'm really encouraged.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, John. So, of course, healthcare professional education, building trust and ethical decision making is absolutely vital for success. Anib, what is the view generally and broadly speaking amongst healthcare professionals of EAPs?
So they are sometimes very useful, very helpful, because especially in the area of inborn errors of metabolism, we have patients who are in desperate need to get some drugs because their condition is lethal and they can show metabolic decompensations within a short period of time. Not all patients have access to clinical studies. So that's why they have to rely on early access programs to get the drug quickly. So they can't wait until the drug is approved in the country. So there's really the matter of time, the issue of time, which is critical in those patients. Of course, we don't know the complete risk profile of these drugs because they have not been used for a long time in a big number of patients. But of course, then we have to be careful. But for many patients, these drugs are essential to survive or to get a good outcome. I'd also like to add on the topic of developing countries. So I'm also a visiting professor in India, university, and I was also in contact often with healthcare providers and also patient groups. And as already mentioned, there are really problems regarding logistics and regarding regulatory processes. Sometimes inadequately. The countries or the politicians want to protect their industry, their pharma, but on the other side, they don't produce any kind of these very special drugs. And also, it's a problem that most of the patients are not insured. They don't have any health insurance. So even if the drug is approved or licensed in their country, they are not able to get it. And so they have to often rely on compassionate use.
Yeah, gosh, brilliant. Thank you. And Dawn, what role do ethics play in EAP recruitment decision making, and how is that reviewed?
Yeah, so, and this comes from my personal view. So, I can't represent any company that I work for or have worked with on this one, but from my personal view on this one, and I don't think I'm alone, everyone and every company involved in the decision or the act of considering access to a drug for a patient should definitely adhere to the ethical standards of what is in the best interest for the patient. Access in this framework, early access, expanded access, compassionate access is treatment, as we've said, and it's not research. And so the goal should always be, again, these are my opinions, what is going to potentially provide the patient with possibility, with opportunity, with chance. And second to that, there should never be any false illusion given to the patient. There should never be any guarantees given to the patient. The company should give the healthcare provider all the information, and the healthcare provider give all the information to the patient, because ultimately it must be the patient who absolutely is the one making and owning that decision as to what is in their best interest for themselves, not being coerced into doing something, not being denied the option to do something, but having full transparency of the risks, of what is known, what is not known, and letting them take the chance. And then as that decision is made, the rest support that in that patient's rights. And when the patient, not every patient wants to move forward. Some patients want to change their mind, and that's okay too. And I think sometimes we get concerned that they might be making the wrong decision, but that's not for us to say. That's not for anybody to say. And still, what is their choice, and supporting that.
And that's an interesting point, Roberta, for you, in terms of that managing expectations and making sure, as we've established, you're a really key part in that communication, that how you manage that with families and patients, because it's undeniable that when people see these things, there's a real flicker of hope and promise, and everyone wants to feel optimistic about it. But how do you balance that with actually, okay, but there are risks, and these are the reality of the situation?
Communication, even though it's wonderful, can also be a double-edged sword. And as John indicated earlier on that slide, it could take upwards of 5 years to have an approval in other part of the world. And these families that are plugged in may be seeing for years the positivity and benefits of other areas of the world having, access to a drug and how it's improving their lives. And Professor Das, pointed out there's a level of desperation with these families, and to what extreme do they exhaust the regulatory pathways and try to understand how to access it, to when they give up and start trying to access that medication on their own.
Mm-hmm. It's difficult to be in that situation where you're dealing with a cross sort of global community, and you've got some that can and some that can't. That's a really difficult position for you to be in, isn't it?
It is. I think managing the expectation, really working so closely with the company to understand what is the expectation to give them. Do we foresee having the opportunity to have some type of access in a year, in 2 years, in 3 years? Will we not know? Will there never be access? We don't know. And really working to still maintain hope that it will be there, but never making promises, as Dawn said earlier as well. It's so important to really stay as a mediator versus a promiser.
Yeah. John, were you going to add something there?
Yeah, I was just one other thing with respect to ethics. Sometimes, when companies are developing medicines that, address significant unmet medical need, the need may be so significant that, the patient is really, they're really, and their physician are really pushing for access early on, and the company sees that need and wants to respond. But there could be a situation where the company has limited, medicine available for their clinical trials. They need to make sure that they can enroll those trials and get the trials completed, because that's how most patients ultimately are going to get access to medicine. But sometimes in those situations, they will allocate a quantity of medicines. And in the past, I think 20 years ago, I was aware of companies that were running lotteries essentially, but today it's become more sophisticated, where companies will sometimes set out external ethics boards that can help kind of looking at each case individually and making a decision of how to allocate that medicine. So that is something that also comes into play as it relates to early access when there's limited drug supply available.
Yeah. And I guess it all goes back to where we started on this particular topic of this section, really, for me, is that real world evidence, and actually the importance of that then feeds back into the ability to be able to push this in different territories when you've got really strong benefit being demonstrated and real strong data to back that up. Becky, I think we've got another poll. Do you want to pop that up for us? So looking at real world data. So should the collection of real world data during an early access program be standard practice? I think we know what we think of that, but let's see what others think.